Welcome to Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree, where we talk about gospel insights through great stories and help you find entertainment that is both true and beautiful. Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree is part of the Public Square Media network of podcasts that seek to bring an LDS perspective into the public square. I'm your host for today, Carl Cranney. I have a PhD in religion, and I have written on the intersection of religious themes in pop culture. And joining me today is, of course, my co-host, Liz.
Hi, everyone. I'm Liz Busby. I am a writer of science fiction and fantasy, an English graduate student at BYU, a reviewer of books, and a Latter-day Saint.
And Jeffrey, could we have you introduce yourself?
My name is Jeffrey Thayne, and I teach psychology at Brigham Young University, Idaho, and I just love science fiction and fantasy, so I'm here for it.
And returning to join us in our third Star Trek episode is Mike Barnhill. Mike, could you introduce yourself, please?
My name's Mike Barnhill. I am a commercial litigator at a law firm in Salt Lake, father of 2, husband of 1, and that takes up pretty much all of my time.
Today, we will be talking about Star Trek Strange New Worlds Season 2. It's a TV show set a few years before the original series takes place in the timeline, so we're with Captain Christopher Pike and the crew of the USS Enterprise a few years before Kirk takes over. Although Kirk is in 4 out of the 10 episodes of this season, he's starting to show up. We had the moment where he's introduced to Spock, and that was fun. But before we get into all that, we have our Best Books segment where we each recommend one thing that we are watching, reading, or listening to. And I'm going to start us off with 2 things that I thought were a little apropos as we discuss this post-scarcity utopia that we all hope that our civilization aspires to someday in the United Federation of Planets. The first is a mini-series on Netflix called Made, and it is about a young woman who has a 2-year-old child whose boyfriend is abusive, and so she leaves him with $18 in her pocket and nowhere to go and no extended family to help her or support her. And it's her trying to navigate all the problems that you have with homelessness, childcare, getting a job, trying to get into college with no money in her pocket, and just the difficulties that our civilization has at this stage for people in those particular situations. And it was one of those that I had to mentally prep myself to watch, but I'm glad that I did. On the flip side is a book called Factfulness, 10 Reasons Why We're Wrong About the World and Why Things Are Better Than You Think, by Hans Rosling. He's done a bunch of TED Talks. We'll link one of them in the show notes. There's a 4-minute one that's worth your time, talking about how basically at a civilizational level, we are doing better now than we ever have in the history of the world. 300 years ago, kings still did not have access to vaccines and running water and medicine and all sorts of things. Basically, the richest person 300 years ago did not live as well as the poorest people today live. And just as a society, as a civilization, as a species, we're definitely moving really well in the right direction. And he has the facts and statistics to back that up. It's a great book to make us realize that, we're doing okay. Not where we should be yet, but we are all headed definitely in the right direction with the reduction of poverty worldwide and all sorts of stuff. Made on Netflix, the miniseries, and then Factfulness by Hans Rosling are my 2 recommendations. Liz, what have you got for us this time?
Mine today is a podcast that just started, but I'm super hyped. It is the Well-Trained Mind podcast by Susan Wise Bauer. Susan Wise Bauer is like my education policy hero. She is big in the homeschooling and classical education movement, but recently she has branched out into just kind of general education and having parents think about what's best for their kids rather than just accept the system that's in front of them. And whether that leads to homeschooling or hybrid schooling or charter schooling, any of those options, she does a really good job thinking through those problems. The podcast has about 3 episodes right now. The first episode is really interesting. It's Susan Wise Bauer and her co-host talking about their experiences being raised in very conservative homeschooling and the pros and cons they saw to that. And I thought it was a very middle-of-the-road view on the advantages and disadvantages of homeschooling that I think everybody should listen to, no matter which side of that debate you're on. It's great, and Susan Wise Bauer is amazing. So highly recommend. Maybe not in everybody's wheelhouse if you're not super interested in classical education like I am, but the Trained Mind podcast.
Jeff, what do you have for us?
I'm currently reading 2 books. One is called Range. I have it right here, actually, by David Epstein. And the subtitle is Why Journalists Triumph in a Specialized World. And the argument that he's making here is that we become more skillful, more resourceful, and broadly more successful when we seek for range rather than when we specialize in a particular skill. And there's pre-stories in this field would make the argument that the greats in any particular field or skill are those who've been tens of thousands of hours practicing and honing their craft. And David Epstein makes the case that, yeah, there's a case to be made for deliberate practice and loss of practice in a particular skill, but there's also a case to be made for learning many skills, learning the art of versatility and how that gives you an advantage, both professionally and in life in general. And I really appreciate that one. And the other one I'm reading that I also recommend is called Exclude Not Thyself by Skylar Sorensen. And is Thriving as a Covenant-Keeping Gay Latter-day Saint to the subtitle. And he's just exploring a little bit of what life is like as a gay Latter-day Saint. And also exploring for those who, for example, identify as gay and want to live their covenants. He explores some of the pitfalls that we sometimes fall into that undermine our own efforts a little bit. And I find that, I think, a tremendous resource for Latter-day Saints generally.
Mike, what have you got for us this time?
I am currently reading Gods and Generals. It's done as a prequel to Killer Angels, which is the book that the movie Gettysburg was based on. Gettysburg is probably my favorite movie. And I had known about it. I'd never taken the time to read it. So I thought, why not? So it's very interesting. He keeps moving it back and forth between some of the key players. The dialogue is so well done. In my mind, I picture the actors like Martin Sheen playing Robert E. Lee. I'm hearing his voice as I read it. So it's fun. I enjoy it. I would recommend it.
We will have links to all these recommendations on our website, popcultureapricottree.com. Buying through these links helps support our podcast so we can keep bringing you the conversations about the true and the beautiful in pop culture. We also wanted to shout out a recent episode from one of our fellow Public Square Media podcasts. Family Bro Evening recently did an episode, it's part 1 of 2, they haven't actually released part 2 yet, on the Strangeite sect with Trevor Harris, who is actually a Strangeite. And I think it's wonderful to see them doing interfaith work between us Latter-day Saints and other of our fellow brother denominations in the broader umbrella of Mormonism. And so it's just a great conversation to listen to. It's always fun to do interfaith work because you see the similarities between your sect or denomination or religion and the one you're comparing yourself to. And in this case, that's just really interesting since we're both Mormon in the broad sense of the movements started by Joseph Smith. And so I think it's a great listen, and I commend them for doing this episode. And now on to our main discussion of the 2nd season of Star Trek Strange New Worlds. I just want to go around the horn real quick and get people's high-level thoughts on the season as a whole before we launch into discussion of individual episodes. What do we think? What do we like?
I mean, I'll just jump in. I loved it. I still think it's doing such amazing work. This is what most Star Trek fans wanted out of Star Trek new series, and I think it's fantastic. They've hit a lot of my favorite Star Trek tropes. We got our trial episode, which is one of my favorite things to see.
I'm going to pitch in and say that I thought it was fantastic as well, and also say that if there's anybody out there who has been resisting watching new Star Trek because they've heard bad things about Discovery or Picard or these others, just give Strange New Worlds a try. It really feels to me like a refreshing return to what Star Trek always is and was. And it seems to me like the writers care about their subject matter. They care about the history of Star Trek, and they're trying to get it right.
I so agree. Goldsman and Myers get Star Trek. They understand what it is, and they produce great content. These episodes were all really good. I think the thing I really like that Star Trek as a whole has been learning over time is how to get good character development done. I think the Next Generation, they had all these episodes, but there were definitely main characters that could have been explored a lot more. Deep Space Nine got a bit better, and they've been moving along, but I think especially in this season, they really tried to focus on giving each of the characters some additional time fleshing out their stories. And I think it was very effectively done.
I would say that one of the reasons why I think traditional Star Trek struggled a little bit with character development and character arcs is because there really were no arcs in Next Generation or the original series to speak of. The series were designed so that any episode could be watched at any time and you are never left wondering where in the broader story this took place. And there was some benefit to that because then you could watch reruns anytime you wanted and never feel lost, right? The problem with Deep Space Nine went all the way the other direction and toward the later seasons where it was all one long serialized storytelling. And at some point, if you just jump in the middle, you might have missed a lot and you don't know what's going on. I think that Strange New Worlds is striking this unique balance where it is still fully individual episode stories, but there's still room for characters to grow and develop across the episodes. They finally nailed that balance for the first time in Star Trek history in my mind.
I think I agree with all of that. That kind of leads to my one complaint about it was that I felt like there were too many episodes that focused on just one character. And as fun as it is, and as right as you are, Jeff, to point out that they are striking the balance between individual episodic storytelling and being able to develop characters over a longer form storytelling arc. I guess that my one complaint would be I didn't feel like there was quite enough ensemble problem solving, the thing that I really like Star Trek for in this season. But when Strange New Worlds is done with its run with its 7 seasons or however many they give it, maybe I'll look back and be like, yeah, season 2 was a little character-centric driven, but overall the whole thing was great. And I suspect that'll be my overall impression of the show as it continues. But I agree. I loved it. I thought it's great. This is the best Trek to come out in a while. I still have a fight between whether I think Captain Pike or Captain Picard is my favorite Star Trek captain. I like all of it. They're doing really well. And there were some great episodes that brought up, I thought, some really interesting moral quandaries and conundrums and things that made you think.
I think that one important thing is that while it's getting back into the form of traditional Star Trek, it's also not being a nostalgia fest. This has its own identity and it knows how to play with the right tropes, but it's not just rehashing things we've all already done before. So I thought they did a great job with that balance.
Because the seasons are shorter, we only have 10 episodes to play with. And I feel like what happened in traditional Star Trek and Next Generation and Voyager and Deep Space Nine is over the course of 24 episodes, you end up having to farm out a lot of episodes to a lot of different writers, and you get this sort of persistent uneven, right? There are some Next Generation episodes that are magnificent and remembered by all. And there are others that you don't remember because you have actively blocked them out of your mind. And and the Janeway Paris Salamander episode, right? Of Voyager.
I don't know what you're talking about. That's not
exactly. But the thing was, I really love about Strange New Worlds is that we haven't had any of those duds. Yes, there's varying degrees of quality. Episodes you like more, episodes I like more, episodes I like less, etc., and so on. But what I find interesting is that the average of them all, even the lowest, is well above the median of some of the older series. And I think that's partly because of the shorter seasons where they can bring their A game the entire way through instead of farming them out to no-name writers. And I just really appreciated having 2 full seasons of the show where I can't say any episode is a complete dud.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Even the worst episodes, because worst is a relative term, is still a very good episode. But yeah, it's always firing on all cylinders. Whatever nitpicks we have, I think seems like everybody agrees that this is a really good show, and we can recommend it to just about anybody.
Another way of saying what you're saying is that the worst Strange New Worlds episode would make for decent Next Generation episodes.
So one trope that I was happy that they brought back from Star Trek Next Generation is that season cliffhanger, right? I don't think we've had that for a while, and this absolutely felt the same as seeing the first half of Best of Both Worlds or whatever. Yeah, it was very intense. And I was like, oh, wait, no, they're not going to wrap this up. And just that same feeling that I had watching the other one live and knowing you had to wait all summer for the next one.
Full spoilers from here on out. I didn't notice that the Gorn were the ones who beamed up all the survivors.
I'm like, that's the round color transporter. Were they just playing weird with the special effects? And then in a moment later, I'm like, oh no.
Oh no.
I think I agree with you. The best Star Trek ending since Best of Both Worlds Part 1, which is just, of course, classic. Picard's been assimilated, and Rocker's like, all right, we're just going to murder him to death. And they fire on him, and that's where the show ends. We'll see what happens. Poor Captain Patel's got Gorn eggs in her, and anyway, yeah, it's going to be interesting, and hopefully the writer's strike resolves soon so they can get to work on season 3.
Oh,
So let's get into some of the individual episodes.
I think Ad Astra per Aspera was great. And it deals with such an important issue in the modern world of growing up with discrimination and yet wanting to be part of and make a contribution to society and like still loving the culture in spite of the flaws of the culture, which led to your own traumas. And Uno is just such a great example of that. And the way they wove that into the episodes that follow is amazing too.
My sister called me up and she says, this felt too woke or too modern or whatever, and so on. And I actually pushed back on her. I said, if you were to take this exact same script, but replace the character names and throw it in Next Generation, would it feel at home? And she thought about it for a moment and she said, absolutely.
Well, because we did. It was that episode with Data. Because to me, the theme isn't so much discrimination. It's belonging. And that's something everyone has stories about, like feeling lonely, feel like they don't belong in whatever group. Go to a Star Trek convention, you're not going to be able to throw a stone without hitting somebody who was like, you know what? I was struggling with feeling like I belonged, and something Star Trek related helped me. That's how I took it.
That's true. It is about the hopeful power of science fiction itself. The idea that the hopefulness of Star Trek is something that gives hope to regular people. I think the one thing that I would have improved about the episode is that we never really get into why the Federation has this prejudice against enhanced beings, and it might have been good to throw in and a little bit of, oh yeah, remember there is actually a good reason we had some traumatic dealings with enhanced beings who tried to murder us all. It was treated as though it was an irrational prejudice when it wasn't necessarily irrational.
It's probably not a coincidence that the one right after it is Tomorrow and Tomorrow,
Where they bring up, and you get to meet young Khan. Although, I gotta say, you guys, you don't have to keep rewriting the timeline. I think we all understand that there are variations on a theme, and the eugenics wars in the original series took place in the 90s, and we're obviously past that now, so now the eugenics wars have to be in the future. Whatever, it's fine. But yeah, I liked that they brought that up. And you're right that the prejudice, is it a prejudice? Because it seems like it's a reasonable thing to do, to quote the line from Deep Space Nine, for every Dr. Julian Bashir that we have, because he's genetically enhanced as well, there's a Khan Noonien Singh waiting in the wings, and it's just not something that they're really willing to take a gamble on. And they have this rule, and it's interesting how they found a loophole in but she's requesting asylum. Anyway, yeah, way to resolve the issue to everybody's satisfaction.
I want to add too that the changing timeline, I did really enjoy how the episode threw shade at the changing timelines a little bit, where you have this Romulan operative it was supposed to be in the 90s, but it wasn't. So I've been waiting here for 30 years. And I just thought that was actually a brilliant little ploy to lampshade their attempt to retcon, but not really. I want to add two things here. One is the Romulan operative I was just talking about. My big complaint about the episode is that, and my complaint about a lot of modern TV, is this tendency to cast younger actors for roles that need older actors. Yes, Romulans are supposed to be long-lived, but quite frankly, there's characters that need gravitas that don't get gravitas because they're cast as young actors. And back to Ad Astra per Aspera, one of the things I really liked about this episode that I found interesting is that, contrary to the claims of wokeism, I found that there were some themes in the show that undermined some of the modern political trends, right? I think the classical civil rights movements, the attitude that you might imagine be something like, I love this country, I love this institution, let me be part of it so I can make it better and carry forward the ideals that we all share, right? And what I sometimes see happening today is almost like this class struggle and power struggle where, because the institution has been discriminatory, we just need to tear the whole thing down, rewrite its entire history, and malign the entire institution and its aims and its goals and its objectives, and recast the institution as the villain, right? And I found it interesting that Ad Astra per Astra, the episode, kind of dealt with the discrimination theme and this desire that number one has to belong to the institution and to be a home there, but in the classical sense rather than in what I would call this new postmodern sense. And I really appreciated that.
Yeah, there's not a lot of burn it down. It's actually something that I don't think Star Trek has ever really, even in Discovery, which arguably is, of the modern series, the one most ensconced in our current political mores, isn't ever burn the Federation down. That's why I like seasons 3 and 4 of Discovery, because it's, oh, this is what we should have been all along. Like, the show should have been optimistic and happy always.
Okay, I wanted to talk about Tomorrow and Tomorrow, though, because I love time travel episodes, first of all, so it was a win instantly for me. But
And an alternate timeline thrown in for good measure.
alternate timeline, but I think only Star Trek has the guts to actually make an episode where you go back in time and have the chance to kill Hitler, only in this case, Khan Noonien Singh, and you don't do it. And it makes you realize why you wouldn't do it. And that is bonker balls that they pulled that off to me.
And the person who doesn't kill him, her last name is Noonien Singh. She is a descendant of him. So we've got the grandfather paradox showing up as well. But she takes this not because of the grandfather paradox. She decides not to act on this because he is just a kid and he has the right to self-determination like anybody else. And she also doesn't want to mess with the timeline. So that's part of it as well. But it's just, she doesn't make it for timeline preserving reasons.
Right? She has every reason to do it. She has history reasons. She has personal animus reasons. She hates that she's had to deal with this legacy her whole life. And yet she's still able to reason that, yeah, he's not currently that person. And it wouldn't be fair to kill him for something he hasn't yet done. That would be immoral.
For me, it raised the broader question too. Once again, do you kill Hitler? Like, the challenge with the entire concept is, for all the evil that Hitler did, it's a lesson that we learned that we carried with us into the future. And I think we are all far more wary of despots and tyrants now because of the horrors that we went through back then. And if it was not then, something like that would have happened later on in a world with more technology and where they could have been more effective. And it's a complicated question. And I found myself wrestling with it while I was watching the episode as well.
I thought the actress Christina Chong did a great job of showing sort of her wrestling with the implications of this choice. Yeah, it was good. The next one was Among the Lotus Eaters, which I thought was really interesting. They go to this planet where everybody loses their memory every night. The person that I thought was the most interesting in this one was the gentleman who is there. He's a member of the society who he knows that he had some family in the past. He had tattoos on his arm, but he actually inked over them. So he knows that like his family died at some point, but he doesn't want to remember that. So he's happy to be a person who forgets every day, wakes up new, just goes and works the fields because he doesn't want the burden of the memories of what he has lost. Because it's a really interesting sort of choice. To just be like, no, I want to forget the things that have caused me pain and sorrow. I will just live absolutely in the moment. And of course, at the end of the episode, he does get his memories back and decides that he had made the wrong choice previously. Yet there was still something that he had captured in his previous sort of philosophy that I thought was really good about not letting grief totally define you and how to live in the moment. It feels very Buddhist to me, not being super attached to things so that it debilitates your ability to move forward. I don't know. I thought there was an interesting philosophical issue that this guy dealt with here amidst all the other things going on with this episode. This was, I think, the most classic TOS, TNG, Trek episode. They went to a planet and they had to solve this thing with an ensemble. Everybody has to play their part to get out of the situation and figure it out.
I liked Ortega's bit. She's freaking out, no idea what to do. Computer tells her what her position is, and somehow that just kind of gets into her.
No, she was a great character this season. I really rooted for her throughout the episodes, that storyline of Ortega's I fly the ship.
I read that they had other plans for her, but because the actress's husband passed away, she was obviously focused on that. And so they dialed back her role in the season to help her, but still include her. I'm sure they had some good stuff planned for her too. But I thought that was really cool. Some of those things are just ingrained. Think about your kids, right? They're just who they are, just naturally.
Yeah, and I think that was the whole point of the episode was without your memories, you're still the same person. Because Captain Pike doesn't become a groveling, sniveling, whatever that this guy he accidentally left behind thought he would become. He's still noble and a leader and unifies people, even without the knowledge that he's a Star Trek captain. He still is who he is. And this guy they left behind, even though he has his memory, he's still who he is, which is a traitorous, revenge-driven kind of person. And you can see that we are like what choices we make, regardless of what our pasts are. And that is clearly illustrated in this lack of memory. You are what you're doing right now.
Cognitive psychology bears this out. We have episodic memory and autobiographical memory. Those are memories of events in our lives, memories about ourselves, etc., and so on. But the vast majority of our memory is procedural memory or variants of procedural memory. And the principle is that neurons that fired together, wired together. As we live our lives and form habits and routines and values and expectations for the world, we're essentially hardwiring all of that right into our brains. And just losing our autobiographical memory isn't going to eliminate all of that. And I felt that was fairly realistic in that sense.
I'm going to say, if you want the sniveling version of Captain Pike, you have to go to the episode of season 1, The Elysian Kingdom, where they all turn into fantasy characters, and he is the sniveling, conniving, backstabbing, traitorous sort of... Anyway, that version of Captain Pike was everything that this ensign in Among the Lotus Eaters thought that he was. Anyway, so that's interesting. Maybe an earlier version of Pike was a little different than he is now. That's an interesting thought, but I like this idea that you hardwire yourself to be the person who you are.
Maybe we could talk about the comedy episodes altogether. There's 3 episodes that are very much humor episodes, which was wonderful, I thought. Charades and Those Old Scientists and Subspace Rhapsody, which was amazing. As a fan of musicals, I could not believe they pulled it off, and they totally pulled it off, and they had an in-world excuse for it, which was amazing.
Okay, so I gotta say, the in-world excuse for the musical...
Why everyone's singing all the time.
I appreciate they want to do a musical episode. And it was a good one, but I'm sorry, it just pales in comparison to Once More with Feeling from season 6 of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which was the original... I went and looked this up. Of all the TV shows that are ever the musicals, that is the first TV show that just did a random musical that was not part of the reason for the show's existence or whatever. It just showed up randomly. That there's a demon that makes everybody in Sunnydale sing and dance. And that was their in-world reason for there being a musical. And I felt that felt a lot better than, oh, we threw a song into this subspace rift and suddenly we have to follow the tropes. And the Klingons are all doing K-pop dancing. It was a great episode, but...
K-pop Klingons.
K-pop Klingons.
It was so classic.
I have watched that clip 40 times. It was fantastic, and it was just so out of nowhere, so unexpected, and so gloriously executed, right? And you could tell these Klingons are just drifting in shame and dishonor, but they can't help themselves. And I just thought that was fantastic. I love the fact that they're in a musical, and even the Klingons are in a musical, but guess what? They're in a human musical, which is just the worst thing they could possibly imagine in their lives.
What would have happened if the Klingons had sent some Klingon opera into the subspace rift?
There we go.
And suddenly all the humans have to follow the tropes of Klingon opera. That would have been really interesting.
I thought the music was great in that episode. I thought the singing was fantastic. So there's some earworms in there. And like you said, the pretext was weak. They could have polished that a little bit more, but whatever. I will say this is the one episode, though, you probably couldn't transport into the Next Generation. It feels at home in Strange New Worlds. It just wouldn't feel at home in either the original series or Next Generation.
I don't know. We had Q transporting everybody to be Robin Hood and everything. That was
true.
Not one of the stronger episodes.
And all of the Sherlock Holmes.
The Elysian Kingdom was the new version of that. There is no real analog for the musical episode in any other Star Trek in existence.
No, there isn't.
Not even, what's the black and white holodeck program they do in Voyager? I can't remember, but where they do that
Captain
space
Proton.
melodrama. Captain Proton, yes. But I think that is one of the problems with setting. They keep picking series that are around the original series, and there are no holodecks, so they can't have an easy excuse for all these weird episodes. If the people can just get stuck in the malfunctioning holodeck, we can do whatever we want.
And the malfunctioning holodeck would have been a better pretext for a musical. Now,
Right.
I have heard people online saying that it felt like the Subspace Rhapsody was a parody of itself. I have heard the argument that a season and a half into the show isn't the time to be parodying your show. Do that in season 6. Give yourself and your characters more space to grow and for your audience to grow and to learn to laugh at itself. Don't do that out the gate. I agree with that.
My complaint about, well, all three of these comedy episodes have gimmicks, right? Charades, Spock gets turned into a human. Haha. It's hilarious. It's very funny. Those old scientists, we have the Lower Decks crossover, which is very funny, although since I don't want to put Lower Decks in my personal headcanon for Star Trek, because there's no koala underlining the universe, and then they literally put the koala underlining the universe in the opening credits for Strange New Worlds. I'm like, no, there's no koala, you guys. That's not a thing. It ruins my suspension of disbelief. And then this third one where they have a musical, Star Trek Strange New Gimmicks. That's what a lot of this season felt to me. And I agree with you, Jeff, that Castle later on, or even Lucifer or other shows where they start to run out of ideas and so they start doing these weird episodes. Did they drop too many of them too early? Even in the light of our earlier discussion that all these episodes are really good. And it's a fantastic musical. And the character development through the musical as well was really good. That whole rock ballad by Lieutenant Noonien Singh, Christina Chong, wow, just knocks it out of the park. It's good stuff. It just feels like there were too many gimmicks this season for me, even though I liked the whole season.
I think the answer is yes. There were too many gimmicks this season. It felt like they were trying to get their best ideas, their coolest, weirdest, novelist ideas out there in case it didn't get a season 3. And as a consequence, it was just a little bit too much. As far as a balanced meal is concerned, you need a few more of the standard episodes it's like a cupcake with too much frosting is the best analogy I can come up with.
There's no such thing.
That's true. Like the going between those old scientists, and then we swing to Under the Cloak of War, and then we swing back to Subspace Rhapsody, and then we swing to Hegemony. It's back and forth between uber serious, kind of dark episodes and very silly, light episodes. Those last 4 episodes were like whiplash.
But there wasn't, at the same time, I really enjoyed in Charades. You could, even though the actress who plays T'Pring was nailing what a Vulcan is, right? You could still sense she's really hurt that her fiance is not trusting her, right? I also think it's interesting. All the canon we have is Spock has always tried to be Vulcan, rejecting his human side as much as his mom wants him to explore it. He rejects it, but now he finally has to deal with it. And even after he gets reintegrated, he still is going down that road until Boimler pops up. This is the Spock that I know. But I just thought that was interesting ways, even in these kind of lighter episodes, to get some really good character development in.
I agree. One thing I would say as well, in addition, is that I have heard people complain that the Spock in this show is not quite the Spock they know and love. And I said, exactly. Because if you were the Spock unloved, then there'd be no room to grow. And what I've seen from the writers of the show is that they are sticklers for the canon. In fact, they probably hold the canon too sacred, if you ask me. They are making sure they are consistent with the canon, even where they shouldn't be. And I fully expect if these same writers stay on board, that we're going to see that character development all the way into the exact Spock that we see in the original series, because they're really trying to be true to the canon. And so just as a reassurance for those out there who aren't sold on watching this yet, they are sticking to the canon of familiar Star Trek rather religiously in that sense.
I think that's true, except for the Gorn, because I went back and rewatched that episode where Kirk fights the guy in the rubber suit. They're like, oh, we've never met these guys before. I'm like, really? I feel like everybody would be like, oh, it's the Gorn, but whatever.
You're right. All right. So that is a deviation for canon, but...
Yeah, but they're certainly trying to stick to, maybe canon's the wrong word, but I don't know what the right word is, but the timeline, this is a younger version of Spock who isn't fully mature in the way we see him in the original series, and then especially in The Next Generation, where he's really come into his own, or even the first of the J.J. Abrams Star Trek movies, as terrible as they were, having the old Spock interacting with his younger self was really interesting, even though that's a different timeline and a universe.
I've erased that the same way you say that Lower Decks is not in your head canon. The Kelvin timeline to me doesn't exist.
So my husband is not a Star Trek fan. I cannot get him to watch Star Trek with me, which is very sad. It is one flaw in our marriage. But he loves the J.J. Abrams movies, and that hurts me inside. And it's because they're the least Star Trek-y of Star Trek. They make great action sci-fi. And if you didn't know they were Star Trek, that'd be fantastic. But it's because they're not Star Trek that I don't like them and he likes them. So there you go.
I like the first one. Don't hate me, but I like the first one.
Get out.
But this episode isn't about Kelvin. I will say this. I do want to make a broader point about Spock again as well, and Vulcan generally. When I watched the original series and The Next Generation, I feel like the Vulcans we see there have never really been recreated by anyone except Tuvok. Because I feel like modern Star Trek, all the way from Enterprise till now, had generally misunderstood what being Vulcan is really about. This is my own personal opinion. I feel like today we see Vulcans as being flat and toneless and just not impassioned about anything and just robotically speaking. That's what it feels like. When you go back to the original series, Spock was thoughtful. He was engaged. He was, in fact, sometimes quite interested and passionate. He was just rational. And you think about rational in the sense of Daniel Kahneman and thinking fast and slow. He just wasn't subject to the same heuristics and biases that we were. And so he could see through some of the emotional reasoning, but he wasn't flat and toneless. He was bemused by human emotions, by sometimes our silliness. But I feel like ever since then, we have been portraying Vulcans as bottling up all their emotions, just uptight about everything. And Spock in the original series wasn't uptight at all. He was just bemused. He was just aloof from it. And I feel like Strange New Worlds does do that a little bit. My other complaint is that Ethan Peck talks too fast for Spock. He's always talking really fast, almost like he's rushing. And I think the Spock I know is a very thoughtful, deliberate character, like for the original series.
Those are all fair complaints. I feel like the same thing has happened with Klingons. They developed the Klingon culture more and more as they went. They're just like quasi-fascist people in the original series. Then the Next Generation became like samurai warriors with this code of honor and ethics that is very different. And maybe Vulcans did the same thing. That'd be an interesting way to see that.
Even Sarek in Next Generation, he wasn't uptight. He was philosophical.
We need to move on, I think, to Under the Cloak of War, because this, for a LDS podcast, talking about
Moral themes.
We have to talk about this episode about revenge and the nature of forgiveness and whether things can be, what's his line towards the very end? I wrote it down here. Some things break in a way that can never be repaired, only managed. This, I thought, was just such a great episode, and I like that I felt disquieted by the end of it. I'm not sure I like Dr. Mbenga anymore, and that is to their credit, I think. Because I don't know that I'm supposed to like him.
I mean, we would definitely get a lot of his past at the beginning of the season. And they've alluded to before, but so heavily involved in the Klingon War. And then we find out not only was he involved, but he did some pretty terrible things. And he doesn't like who that made him. Right? And so he's working to basically go the opposite, be a doctor. But when he's there, it brings up some of those feelings that he probably thought he maybe not got rid of, but buried deep enough. And turns out, not really. I think that's something we can all sympathize with.
Although, in his defense, he maybe buried those emotions for generic Klingons, but then he meets the one Klingon, the butcher of, I forget the name of the planet now. He meets that one guy who he knows is a fraud because he was there. And he's like, no, you don't get to live a life. And I don't know, it's just really interesting.
I agree with you. I don't know that I like him anymore. To their credit, this was not a disappointing episode. I'm not complaining about the episode. I just realized that the character they've made is created for him is not a person that I admire anymore. I used to see it as this somewhat philosophical, very measured, temperate, controlled individual. And now in my mind, actually now represents almost an anti-Christian ethic. This whole episode for me painted a world without Christianity, a world where some things break that cannot be repaired, only managed. A world where some people just cannot be forgiven. A world where redemption is not possible, either for the Klingon or for the Doctor. Sure, the Doctor is healing people, but he doesn't see himself as redeemed. He's just managing. He's not repairing the past. It cannot be repaired. He's not repairing himself. It cannot be repaired. He's simply managing all the way through. And it's essentially what my life would be like without Christ. The things I've done in the past, the traumas that I have that cannot be healed, the sins I committed that can never be redeemed. And all I could do is just carry them around with me, an ever-increasing load, managing their effects until the end of my life. That's what the world would be like for me without Christ. And I see that in the Doctor. And it's a terrifying look and almost like a mirror universe of what it would be like if I didn't have the gospel of Jesus Christ in my life.
We're going to have to find that clip where he and Captain Pike are talking to each other, and we'll just stick it in right here so you all listening to the podcast can listen to their conversation. But I love the idea that Captain Pike is like,
the Federation believes everyone deserves a second chance.
What about justice? What about the victims? Doesn't everyone deserve to pay for their actions?
So who decides? Who pays and who gets redemption? Where's the line?
You're right, Chris. We've known each other for a very long time. See eye to eye on most things. But you haven't lived my life. You have the privilege of believing in what's best in people. Me? I happen to know there's some things in this world that don't deserve forgiveness.
and of course, as Christians, there is no line. Who pays? Christ does. Who gets redeemed? Everybody who comes to him. Where's the line? There is no line. Jesus died for all of us. And this is one of the flaws of the post-scarcity utopia vision of humanity that they have here is they lack that Christian ethos. And this episode brought that to the fore very strongly.
Maybe for some people, because like you said, the choice is whether you come to Christ. That's really the trigger, is the person who makes the choice opens that door for the Savior to step in and do what he needs to do for that person. So we've got Mbenga, who's making the choice not to. But we've got the Klingon ambassador who did, at least from what we can tell. He may be faking it too, I don't know.
Certainly faking some of it. Like lying a little bit about some of the details that caused him to flip the switch. But at least in my impression, he had flipped the switch.
That was the impression I got. And see, the message isn't so much there's a lack of that, but just it really is a choice. It's in our power to decide what we're going to do.
One thing that I find interesting about Star Trek generally is that for me, it really is an excellent depiction of a thoroughly secularized universe. And I actually shared this with my students in class last week, where I threw up a picture of a scene from Narnia, Chronicles of Narnia. And then I threw up a scene from Star Trek. And I said, can we tell the same types of stories in both of these universes? And the answer is no. Because in Narnia, you have stories of good versus evil, the universe with a divine moral sovereignty to whom everyone's accountable. And in Star Trek, you don't actually get stories of good versus evil. Not really. Sure, even the dark episodes like this one, you have good guys and bad guys and the gray muddled middle all the way in between. But good guys and bad guys are not necessarily a story of fundamental good versus fundamental evil, because the whole episode makes a point that it's just all shades of gray all the way through. The vast majority of Star Trek storytelling is not good versus evil, but enlightenment versus ignorance. It's the main theme. It's all the way through. Sometimes good guy versus bad guy, but the good guys are good because they're more morally enlightened, not because they have been transformed or redeemed from their fallen nature, as we might say in a Christian universe. And just I found myself thinking deeply after watching this episode about what it means to live in a Christian universe, where we are, all of us, even Hitler himself, going back to our earlier conversation, is answerable to the same divine moral sovereign that I am, right? And then asking the question, if that divine moral sovereign told me I have forgiven him, could I give Hitler himself a hug and become his buddy? And I don't know the answer to that, right? We're going to find lots of people who were awful on earth in the celestial kingdom with us, I'm sure. Like, repentance is a thing, both in this life and in the world to come. And that leads us to grapple sometimes a little bit. I have a friend who wants to someday write a story called Literally Hitler, which tells the story of Adolf Hitler, who survived World War II and then went on to become this stellar exemplar of moral goodness because he turned his life around. And what would that actually look like in practice? And could people actually learn to forgive? Those are the sort of questions that I started thinking about after watching this episode, which tells me that even though it was an episode that I didn't actually love because it wasn't optimistic in the way that Star Trek often is, it was still a really good one.
Yeah. Just a thought for those of you interested in that sort of thing. The movie, which is based on a book called The Railway Man, is about a British prisoner of war who was severely mistreated by the Japanese in World War II. And he goes to try to find the commandant of the camp he was in to kill him. When he finds him later on, only to find out that the guy has been so ashamed of his actions that he's now running a Buddhist shrine somewhere as his Roman Catholic style penance for all the sins he committed and the atrocities he presided over in World War II.
And I think that kind of radical forgiveness that we're talking about in this episode, because it's not like the guy who Mbenga is mad at is just a guy who slighted him or told a false rumor to aggrandize himself. He is someone who led troops that killed his friends, that's guilty of war crimes. It's a kind of radical forgiveness that is more difficult than the forgiveness that most of us have to go through unless we've been through some kind of extreme trauma in our lives. But I think you're right, Jeffrey, that it's super important as Christians to work towards that, even if we're not able to get there right now, that we should always be continually striving in that direction. In my writing class right now, our theme of the class is around President Nelson's talk about peacemakers wanted, that radical ability to make peace, to listen to others, and to realize that everyone is a person at the bottom, no matter what they've done. They were a human being, and they are a human being, and that we could also go that way ourselves, and we need to extend grace in as much as we can, and then ask Christ to do the rest for us that we can't. Because sometimes we are like Mbenga in our lives where we can't forgive someone. And we can't demand that of ourselves right now, but as long as we're striving towards that, I think that's the right thing for us to be doing.
And I found myself screaming at the screen, not literally, but as he was saying that something can never be healed, or they're broken permanently, they can only be managed, right? And something will never be forgiven. And I wanted to say, but don't you see that the very key to that healing that you seek, that you claim to be is impossible, is to forgive that man in front of you fully and completely. And if you could find it in yourself to do that, then you will find the healing that you claim to be impossible. You do the impossible forgiveness to find the impossible healing. And that's what I found so fascinating, is that the formula was right there on the screen. And he just didn't connect those dots because he didn't have the means to, because it doesn't exist in the secular world in which he lives.
All right, who wants to talk about hegemony? Man, Star Trek horror, I'm here for it. And they did such a great job of having the Gorn be super creepy in the last season, and here they are now. I love that we had a moment where there was a full adult Gorn in a spacesuit that they had to fight, and I'm like, ooh, here it is. And then I went and watched the one with the rubber suit from James Kirk from the original, and I'm like, no, that guy would have smoked you in 3 seconds. He would have just run up and disemboweled Kirk.
Yes, it definitely gave me some creepy horror vibes. It almost felt Walking Dead-ish, right?
Yes.
Like this survivor, post-apocalyptic.
Very Walking Dead post-apocalyptic vibe as they're moving their way through the city with all the cars that are still on fire, even though they would have burned out hours ago, because that's just part of how post-apocalyptic worlds work. Fires never go out. They nailed the mood of that, I thought, very well. And then you got to meet Scotty, and that was great.
That was not expected.
Some of the things they did with the Gorn, just no communications. All they get is basically a picture. This is ours. This is yours. Just adding to the alienness of them. They're savage, right? Very animalistic, but at the same time, they're building these incredibly powerful ships. They've got as much, if not more technology than the Federation does. And that's an interesting way to think of them.
Because all the other species, I think with the exception of maybe Klingons, are all implied to have come from omnivore stock in their previous evolution. And the Gorn are absolutely predators, and now they have spaceships.
It reminds me of the Calvin and Hobbes comic. It's a dinosaur in a fighter jet kind of thing, right?
T-Rex is in fighter jets, that's right.
I will say Star Trek has always fallen for the trope that the villains eventually become the heroes, right? You have the Klingons, and eventually they become friendly with the Federation and eventually become allies. You have the big Borg, and eventually the Borg show up often enough. In Voyager, they start making alliances. And then in Star Trek Picard, you end up with friendly Borg and your species 8472 in Voyager. And then a couple seasons later, friendly 8472 is a theme that we see both in Star Trek and Marvel and every other franchise too. Because if you keep the villain around long enough, the audiences start to love them. And when the audiences start to love them, you can't make them do horrible, awful things anymore. And if you can't make them do horrible, awful things anymore, you got to redeem them. And what I worry a little bit about is there's these foreshadowings in this Gorn episode that there's more that they don't know, that there's a secret to communication they're about to unlock or something like that. And I'm worried that just 2 Gorn episodes in, they're already redeeming the villains, on the way to redeeming the villains.
I think we know a little bit about the future with the Gorn. It gets mentioned in Star Trek Discovery and stuff. They don't ever become part of the Federation, so I don't know. We'll see how this all shapes out.
I think Lower Decks might have had a Gorn officer.
So I looked this up, and this is another reason why Lower Decks is not headcanon for me, because there's like a Gorn butcher randomly on one of the planets. He's like there chopping meat up in a booth somewhere next to a Quarks. And I'm like, no, stop it.
That was 100 years later. The Gorn have evolved and become friends again like they always do.
No, they're predator species. They are Tyrannosaurus and F-16s, and that's all they should ever be.
I was mad when they redeemed the Borg in Picard because what we need are villains who just stay villains. Going back to the whole Christian redemption for everything, too, that's all true, right? But sometimes we need stories where villains are just villains through and through all the way. When it came to the Borg, like, it's not people. It's essentially a computer virus that infects people, right?
Yeah.
That's not something you need to redeem. You don't need to sympathize with a computer virus. It's just this nameless, faceless horror out there that you run from, right? And I just wish they had kept it that way. Because the moment you get the Borg Queen and the Star Trek First Contact, the moment you personalize the Borg. And they're no longer this faceless computer virus that affects people. They're led by a person with a name and a face. And then you can start making alliances, and then everything just falls apart from there.
Yeah, and there's a reason why we've never done episodes of Star Trek Picard here in our podcast, because I think it would just be me and Liz ripping on it.
I hear season 3 is lovely, but I haven't made it through season 2 yet.
You don't need to. Just watch season 3.
Star Trek Picard, to me, just really quick, suffers from the same problem that the sequel trilogy for Star Wars did, in that they had 3 different people show-running 3 different movies and 3 different seasons of Picard, and they didn't have any kind of overarching plot. That's why the Borg keeps showing up in Picard with such radically different takes on them, because they're like, oh, who's a bad guy we could use to make this point? Let's make it the Borg, but they're going to be a little different this time. And it's just like, oh, stop it. Just have a Bible, you guys. A show Bible will really help you. So I hope they have something in mind with the Gorn to make them a recurring villain over the series that may this have another couple of seasons.
I hope they keep the Gorn as Tyrannosaurs and F-16s. Just
absolutely
carnivores all the way through. Maybe they find some way to communicate and create borders and barriers, but I do not want them to redeem the Gorn.
All right. Let's wrap up now with our ratings segment. We give every movie or TV show that we watch ratings on 3 scales. The first is clean versus objectionable material. We rated according to the LDS Afterlife, celestial, terrestrial, telestial, or outer darkness. Where would you guys place season 2 of Star Trek Strange New Worlds on that scale?
Terrestrial.
Yeah, just because of the violence in the war episodes. I am watching with my kids. We're in the first season right now, but my youngest has to skip out on some of these war episodes that are too intense, or especially the final episode, Hegemony, is going to be too scary for little kids, a little bit violent.
My 6-year-old has seen Space Rhapsody. I'd let my 6-year-old watch probably 6 or 7 episodes of the season. But there are some episodes I wouldn't want them to watch until they're 14. And like the war one, I wouldn't want to watch that until they're 14. Yeah, terrestrial.
Terrestrial for me as well, I think. So it seems like we're all in agreement on that one. Our next rating is artistic merit. Skillful, effective use of craft on a scale of 1 to 5 popcorn balls. I'll go first. Aside from maybe too many shenanigan episodes, it's great. And that complaint of mine still did not lessen my enjoyment of the season. I'm just going to give this 5 popcorn balls.
I can't disagree. High production values, really fun script, just great.
And the singing was amazing.
Amazing.
So if we're talking about just brilliant execution of the project they're doing, 5 popcorn balls. It was fun all the way through, brilliantly executed. No complaints on that front whatsoever. Is it great art? No, but Star Trek never was.
I think we rate it on a scale of what was it trying to do and did it achieve that?
Yes.
And I think it does.
Yeah.
5 out of 5 on that one.
Mike, how about you?
Definitely a 5. 100%.
This is boring, you guys. We need to disagree with each other a little bit. And our last rating is Gospel Connections for morally edifying messages, 1 to 5 apricots.
This is a tough one because there were episodes that really got me thinking about what it means to be Christian and the benefits of the gospel. But the episode itself was anti-gospel in that sense, right? There were connections aplenty, but those were connections I brought to it rather than connections the show made.
Yeah, agreed. I love Star Trek. I feel bad. I don't think I can give it a 3 even. I think I would give it a 2. There are some interesting messages, and Jeffrey pointed out there's a great anti-message in, is this healthy to hold on to these kind of grudges and resist forgiveness? But it is explicitly against the message of the show and using it as a counterexample.
So both of you get 2. That's interesting. Is it the case that I feel like maybe we are reading too much of our Christian ethos into that episode and saying, oh, he didn't make the right choice? I think the episode is arguing that he can't make that choice. That's the thesis statement he closes the episode with. Some things are broken beyond repair. They can only be managed. And we Christians say, no, that's not true. But that's the thesis of the episode. He's not making a wrong choice. He is making the choice available to him. It's compatibilist free will, not libertarian free will, for those of us with a philosophy background. Maybe Mike and I are the only ones who understood that terminology. I'm going to give it 3 just because I feel like there were a couple of good episodes, ad astra per aspera, that help us think about the nature of our society and civilization and how we want to be inclusive and yet be our best selves and aspire to that while also recognizing the things we haven't maybe gotten right in the past. And then just the general Star Trek vibe of let's work together and do things and be good people. And you're right, I think, Jeff, that Star Trek as a whole is more enlightenment versus ignorance rather than good versus evil. But there is a really good case to be made that enlightenment is a Christian virtue as well. I'm going to give it 3 because Star Trek always makes you think about these moral issues, and that's worth something.
Yeah, that's why I would give it a 3, because Star Trek from the very beginning has always been think about it. It doesn't always give you the answer. It presents a couple of different perspectives and makes you think. And I think this season certainly did that.
Almost that persuades me. Star Trek from the original series until today has been aggressively secular. That's in some ways the point of the show, right? To showcase a secular humanist utopia, what it looks like. And it's always caught with this veiled dismissal of religion generally, except with some exotic exceptions, right? But at the same time, I find myself referencing Star Trek even in all my gospel writings. And I suspect the same will continue to be true of Strange New Worlds. So often by way of contrast. So I've recently found myself writing about the redemptive gospel and using the therapeutic gospel, the therapeutic worldview as a contrasting framework and using Star Trek to illustrate what that looks like. But nonetheless, those are connections. So I could be persuaded of a 3 if I'm pushed to it.
I was recently having this conversation with a friend, like, why do Latter-day Saints in particular, and perhaps religious people in general, love Star Trek, even though it's explicitly secular humanist? And I think it's because even though it's a different moral system than ours, The show is a show focused on morality. It has a moral worldview, and the questions of making the right choices are super important to the series. There are plenty of series where that's not the focus, and so it's refreshing to have a show that takes morality and choosing the right seriously, even if the right is sometimes different than the right we see.
And I want to add a quick additional thought to that as well. We live right now in almost this morally relativistic, expressive individualist culture, right? It's very permissive culture. But what we see in Star Trek is a community of people striving towards a shared vision and a shared set of ideals. To be a crew member, you can't just be yourself all the time. You have to subject yourself to ideals that have command over you in some way. You have a command structure, a set of Federation principles that you have to follow, even if all your preferences lean the other direction. And I haven't really seen a lot of expressive individualism in Star Trek. Aggressive secularism, yes, but not expressive individualism. And I think Strange New Worlds has some forays into expressive individualism, particularly a song in Subspace Rhapsody was expressive individualism in a nutshell, right? The one where, number one, thinking about being authentically you, right? Which is very expressive individualism. I think one reason why Latter-day Saints love Star Trek is because we are institutionalists at heart. We believe that we are building a kingdom of God on earth that will carry with it ideals that we shall all subscribe to. And it's really fun to see that on screen. It's one of the very rare shows where the institution at the center of the show are the good guys, right? So many other shows are rebels against the institution, rebels against the empire, or the FBI or CIA are always infiltrated or subverted or some way or another. But in Star Trek, the institution is the good guy almost all the time. And I think that's one reason why we like it.
And the fact that it's a military outfit, I think, helps that as well. There are the structures they have to follow. There are commands. This was my complaint about some of the discoveries I felt. I'm like, no, guys, don't debate and have a conversation with the entire crew about what you should do. The captain should just give an order and let's do that thing.
And I remember when Captain Picard gave Wesley the beatdown because he violated the directives of their superiors. He said, it does not matter what your conscience says. You do what your superiors tell you. And I'm like, oh, Captain Picard, you're so wise. And this is my one grievance with the season is the Spock disobeying the orders in the first episode of the season. We didn't talk about that episode at all, but that was my one grievance. We've already done that so many times. And that you take away the weight of the mutiny of the search for Spock and they're stealing the Enterprise. It's already done it 3 times before.
Fair enough. All right. Thanks for joining us for this episode. You can follow my writing. I am on Threads now at Carl Cranney because Twitter is a dumpster fire the last couple of weeks. And I think I'm just going to abandon ship. Liz, where can people find you on social media?
You can follow my writing and book reviews at lizbusby.com.
Jeffrey, where can people find you if they want to get a hold of you?
Latter-day Saint Philosopher on Twitter.
There you go. And Mike, I know you don't have any social media, so if you want to complain about it, send me an email and I'll forward it to Mike.
Still no online presence. Sorry.
It's fine. Thanks for joining us this week. If you've enjoyed this episode, share the podcast with a friend who enjoys good movies or good TV shows and good conversation. You can also subscribe on the podcast platform of your choice or watch us on YouTube where you can see my Star Trek shirt. Liz, can you tell us what we will be discussing in our next episode?
Yes, next time we're going to be discussing Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris, a 2022 film about a widowed cleaning lady fulfilling her lifelong dream of owning a haute couture dress, which sounds really frivolous when I summarize the film, but it uses it to grapple with issues of class and ageism. How many movies do you know that star old women? So I grew up with the 1992 version starring Angela Lansbury, but that's not available on streaming, so we're watching the remake from 2022. There's a little bit of swearing and other content, so check the reviews to see if it's for you, but overall, it's a really heartwarming film, very unique story. It's available on Amazon Prime or for rent on various services, so you can be ready for that conversation in 2 weeks.
This has been Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree, encouraging you to seek after everything virtuous, lovely, of good report, or praiseworthy. See you next time.
Hey, I'm JC. Hey, I'm Scott. Welcome to Family Bro Evening.
We're members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, looking to understand and break down some of those confusing LDS beliefs and culture quirks.
In other words, we ain't your bishop's fireside.
Our podcast is all about LDS beliefs and doctrine.
We want to present a rational discussion on our beliefs, debunk some myths, explore the culture, and ask the hard questions.
We hope you'll join us in this journey, learn something new, and hopefully have a little bit of fun.
Join us every 2 weeks wherever you find podcasts.